in our lives. It's absurd that we'll trust anything else but not trust God. Now, there are two ways, there are more than two, but there are two main ways I want to point out to you that God uses to get us out of our independence. The first one is waiting. Kind of stillness descends when that word waiting is pronounced. Nobody enjoys waiting, least of all contemporary Americans. As I think Billy Graham said once years ago, an American feels frustrated if he misses the swing on the swing door and has to wait for the door to revolve the second time. So it's totally contrary to our present cultural slant to wait. But nothing will come to you in your Christian walk sooner or later until you learn to wait, because God insists on it. I want to talk about just two people, two great men of God who had to wait. They're two of the patterns of Scripture. The one is Abraham and the other is Moses. And God had a destiny for both of them. He knew what they were going to do. He chose them. He set them apart. And part of God's, in fact, the very center of God's whole program for Abraham was that he was to have a special son by his wife Sarah. And this was promised him early on when he was 75 years old. And he had to wait 25 years for that son. Why? Why couldn't God give it to him immediately? Because he had to bring Abraham to the place of total dependence on God. You know the story. After 13 years, after 12 years, he said, I've waited long enough. And his dear wife Sarah gave him some bad advice. Said, go on, have a concubine. I'll agree. My servant Hajar, which means a stone, I'll let you have a child by her. It's very interesting because Sarah gave him two pieces of advice. The first time she said, go on, have a child. The second one was, cast out the son you've had. When you get carnal advice, it contradicts itself. And what was the result? Ishmael. Now I want to go into a lot of what could be controversial political issues, but I'd have to say basically one main problem of Isaac and his descendants for 4,000 years has been Ishmael and his descendants. So that's a warning against taking things into your own hands. Because if you do, what you'll produce will not be an Isaac, but an Ishmael. If I were to ask you, and I don't want to, but how many of you here have produced Ishmaels at some time in your life? A lot of you, if you were honest, would put your hands up. Why? You were not willing to wait. So Abraham had to learn to wait. What was the result of waiting? He came to the place where he was totally dependent on God. Had no alternatives, nothing. He'd exhausted every other possibility. And when he was at that place, God met him, and he had the son that God had promised. It's interesting, if you go on, God tested Abraham in a way that he wouldn't test all of us. Here's Abraham, he's got the son, and then God says, now, offer him as a sacrifice. I mean, he tested Abraham in a way that he wouldn't be able to test most of us. So once again, Abraham was totally dependent on God. He was prepared to kill the son and depend on God to raise him up, as the scripture indicates. What was God aiming at? One thing. Dependence. Total dependence on God. Now we'll take Moses. Moses had a very privileged upbringing. He was brought up in the court of Pharaoh. He was instructed in all the wisdom and the culture of the Egyptians, who were the leading cultural empire of the day. Then he realized that he was really a Jew, an Israelite, and his brethren were suffering. And he thought, I'm the one, I'll go out, deliver them. Age 40. It ended up in a fiasco. He had to flee for his life. And he spent the next 40 years in a rather barren wilderness looking after a little flock of sheep belonging to his father-in-law. That's not a very exalting position, is it? Incidentally, have you ever looked after sheep? Some of you may have done. I did once for a little while. That takes patience too. I'll never do that. So now, Moses has reached the age of 80, retirement age. His life has gone. He has nothing to show. All his education, all his ability, all his strength have produced nothing. And God says, now, Moses, we can begin. And for the next 40 years, Moses was, in my opinion, the most powerful human being that history has ever recorded. I mean, if you consider what he did, it is astonishing. And shall I tell you one reason? You want to be a man of power? I'll tell you one of the secrets. It's in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3. Now the man, Moses, was the meekest man on all the earth, or the humblest. Can you see that God cannot trust power to anybody except the humble? How do you achieve humility? Just spend 40 years in the desert with a flock of sheep. Somebody asked Bob Mumford once, why did Moses have to spend 40 years in the desert? And Bob answered, because God couldn't do it in 39. So God will keep you there till it's done. You can struggle, you can complain, you can pray, but God is too merciful to answer your prayers, because He's going to leave you till the process is complete. So that's way number one to get the independent people to become dependent. It's by waiting. And there's some other interesting scriptures on waiting which I'd just like to point out to you. Does anyone have a new international version here near the front? Thank you. Don't lose everything for that. Thank you. I want to read Isaiah 64 verse 4. The reason I do that is because this translation is particularly vivid. Isaiah 64 verse 4. Since ancient times, no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you, a totally unique being without parallel. And then it mentions one fact about this unique God. No eye has seen any God besides you who acts on behalf of those who wait for Him. So what is the distinctive feature of this unique God? Tell me. He acts on behalf of those who wait for Him. You want God to act on your behalf? Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. That's a lovely Bible. Let me ask that question again. You want God to act on your behalf? So what do you have to do? Wait for Him. What will happen while you're waiting? You'll become more and more dependent on God and less dependent on yourself. And there's nothing will do it but waiting. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul speaks about his original contact with the Christians in Thessalonica, and how other people reported the remarkable impact that he had. And in 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 9 and 10, Paul says of these other people around, for they themselves declare concerning us what manner of entry we had to you, that's the Thessalonians, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for His Son from heaven. So what were the two things they had to do? To serve and to wait. You see? Now that's the Christian life. We're all, some of us, excited about serving. How many of us are excited about waiting? But the Christian life is not just serving. It's serving and waiting. Why? Well, one reason is because waiting deals with that independent spirit in you. It brings you to the place of, God, there's nothing I can do. I've come to the end. If you don't do it, it won't happen. And you know that God is waiting for many of you to come to that place. Let me read you a passage from Isaiah chapter 30, which I think is a message for some of you here this morning. Isaiah 30, just two verses 18 and 19. Therefore the Lord will wait, that he may be gracious to you. Please note that it's not only you who have to wait. God waits. Why does he wait? That he may be gracious. He's waiting for you to meet the conditions for him to show you his grace. And therefore he will be exalted, that he may have mercy on you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for him. All right? You want to be blessed? That's one way. Then it goes on in the next verse. For the people shall dwell in Zion at Jerusalem. You shall weep no more. He will be very gracious to you at the sound of your cry. When he hears it, he will answer you. What is God waiting for? The sound of your cry. He's waiting till you are desperate. Until you come to the place where nothing will suffice but God. See, a lot of us are afraid of desperation. I think it's very typical of the British character. We like to have things so we don't get on too intense an emotional plane. But there's a place where you can meet with God only if you cry. That Hebrew word to cry, it means to cry out for help. I think the modern translations translate it that way. But God is waiting to bring you to a place where you cry out for help. Now the other day, Ruth tells me not to put all her dirty linen in public, but the other day I did what I must usually do in the afternoon. If you want to know, between 2 and 4 o'clock, you probably won't find me, because I lie before the Lord. And while I was doing that, Ruth was seized with this intense pain, which is quite serious. I mean, it could be quite serious. And having done everything she could, she just lay on her back on the floor and cried out to the Lord to come to her help. And he did. There was a definite change. I sometimes wonder, frankly, having lived with Ruth for 14 years, how God could be so cruel to anybody as he is to her. Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, God puts her through things that I wouldn't put anybody through, let alone my wife. What is he after? I can't tell you everything, but I know one thing he's after: desperation. Some of you can look back in your life and remember the point when you became desperate. And God moved. God is not a luxury. God is essential. And as long as anything else may be more important to us than God moving, he probably won't move. Again, God dealt with people all through the Bible to bring them to the place of desperation. One of the most obvious examples is Israel being delivered out of Egypt. So they march out, they've had a wonderful Passover, they've all been healed, become strong, able to march. They march out in ranks,